We think we know Kursk, Tigers and T-34s trading shots on an open plain, but this wasn't just a tank duel, it was where some of the most hardened formations on Earth crashed into each other at point-blank range. On one side, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, Leibstandarte, das Reich, Totenkopf, veterans of Kharkov, the Caucasus, and the long retreat from the Volga. On the other, Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, Elite Guards Rifle and Airborne Divisions, and Soviet Tank Corps tempered in the ruins of Stalingrad. These weren't raw conscripts and half-trained crews. This was the cream of the crop, sent into a battlefield already wired with mines, trenches, and pre-sighted artillery. When Citadel finally opened, the myth of a clean, armoured showdown vanished in minutes. Panthers burned before they reached the start line. Ferdinands killed at long range, then died under sappers. Guards tankers rode into the attack clinging to the hulls of their T-34s, straight into SS Panzer Grenadiers fighting from foxholes and ditches. Fields turned into mazes of wrecks and shell holes where men and machines fought at touching distance. This is Kursk as it really was. Not just the story of famous tanks, but of elite divisions on both sides thrown into a mechanical slaughter that would help decide the fate of the Eastern Front, in fact Europe itself, and was far worse than the legend suggests. The destruction of 6th Army at Stalingrad did not end the German campaign in the south, it unleashed a crisis. As the frozen Volga front collapsed, the Red Army surged forward like a released spring. Soviet spearheads pushed west and southwest across the Donets in the opening months of 1943, rolling back exhausted German formations and retaking Kharkov on the 14th of February. To many at the time, it looked as if the Soviet advance was unstoppable. But Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, saw something else. An enemy outpacing its own supply lines. When Soviet armor finally outran its fuel and ammunition, Manstein struck. Fresh panzer divisions, including the SS Panzer Grenadiers, slammed into the exposed Soviet flanks. In a matter of days, 2 entire Soviet fronts were torn apart. The counter-offensive ended in the brutal close-quarters battle for Kharkov, where SS assault groups fought block by block to retake the burning city. It was one of the last truly decisive operational victories the Germans would win on the Eastern Front, bought with blood and exhaustion. Further north, in the forests and frozen fields around Oral, the Soviet winter offensive ground itself down against Günther von Kluge's Army Group Center. By early spring, operations everywhere slowed to a crawl. The thaw arrived, and with it the infamous Rasputitsa, that sucking, glue-like mud that clung to tank tracks, wagon wheels, and the boots of men who were now 3 winters deep into the war. Horses collapsed in the mire, trucks bogged to their axles, columns stopped moving. When the ground finally began to harden again, the map of the front showed a single massive feature, a Soviet bulge, roughly 150 miles from tip to base, pushing west around the city of Kursk. It was here, in this great protruding wedge, that the Germans planned their next move. The German High Command understood the stakes. Summer 1943 would mark the 3rd season of war in the East. The Red Army was now larger, better equipped, and recovering faster than anyone in Berlin had imagined. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was bleeding out. Divisions rebuilt only on paper, replacements too young or too old, panzer regiments refitted with new tanks they barely had time to train on. After Kharkov, Manstein believed a stalemate was still possible. Hitler, increasingly isolated and convinced of a decisive blow, wanted more. To seize back the initiative, Colonel General Kurt Zeitzler proposed an ambitious plan. Eliminate the Kursk salient in a giant pincer attack. The idea was simple on paper. From the north, Model's 9th Army of Army Group Center would drive south. From the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and General Werner Kempf's army detachment would drive north under Manstein. If both spearheads met, the Soviet forces inside the salient would be encircled and destroyed. The front would straighten, troops could be shifted west, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners could be put to work in the factories and farm fields of the Reich. Zeitzler put his faith in Germany's new heavy armour, the Panther and the Ferdinand, machines he believed would punch through the Soviet lines and restore German armoured superiority. But at Hitler's headquarters, the plan did not inspire confidence. When the Führer presented Citadel to his senior commanders on the 3rd to the 4th of May, the reaction was hesitant. Manstein argued that the attack might have worked in April when the original order was signed, but every week of delay made success less likely. Model warned bluntly that the Soviets knew exactly what was coming and were preparing fortress-like defences. Guderian dismissed the whole operation as pointless, warning that the Panthers and Ferdinands were nowhere near combat-ready and would only add to the inevitable losses. Von Kluge supported the operation, but only because supporting Hitler was safer than opposing him. He wanted the attack launched immediately, not out of optimism, but so he could claim no responsibility if it failed after further postponements. And so, in the spring and early summer of 1943, as the mud dried and both sides prepared for one of the largest battles in military history, the die was cast. Citadel would go ahead. Germany's last great summer offensive was coming, and no one on either side fully understood how much blood would be spilled in the fields around Kursk. When Wilhelm Keitel tried to justify the offensive on political grounds, Guderian snapped back in frustration. How many people do you think even know where Kursk is? Even Hitler admitted the whole plan made his stomach turn, and yet he still approved Citadel and then delayed it for 2 fatal months, waiting for the new Panther tanks and Ferdinands to arrive at the front. Historian Charles Winchester later put it bluntly, believing that a battle involving millions of men across a front half the size of England could be decided by a few hundred untested tanks was a kind of touching faith in technology. In the East, technology alone never saved anyone. Hitler's hesitation gifted Stalin exactly what he needed. On the Soviet side, Marshal Zhukov and Vasilevsky urged a simple strategy: let the Germans come, let them bleed themselves white against prepared defences, and then counterattack. Stalin agreed. What followed was one of the largest defensive constructions in military history. 500,000 railcars rolled into the Kursk salient that spring, unloading division after division of men, guns, timber, wire, mines, and concrete. Entire towns near the front were evacuated. 300,000 civilians, mostly old men and women, dug trenches day and night. The southern face of the salient alone held 2,600 miles of trenches. Minefields were packed so densely, 5,000 mines per mile in some sectors, that German engineers later said the ground itself felt alive. The defences were not just deep, they were designed. Dug to channel panzers into pre-sighted kill zones, anti-tank strongpoints, and hidden artillery nests. To the Germans, it looked like a man-made labyrinth. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin summed up the situation with bitter clarity. The Russians were aware of what was coming. They converted Kursk into another Verdun. We threw away our advantage in mobile warfare and chose to attack the strongest fortress in the world. Against them, the Soviets had twice the men, more than double the guns and mortars, 900 additional aircraft, and 750 more tanks. But German morale remained strangely high. In the darkness before the attack, one SS man whispered to himself outside a command bunker, "The mud might slow us down, but it cannot stop us. Nothing will." A Großdeutschland fusilier recalled the same feeling, the belief that this blow, this one summer offensive, could still turn the war back in Germany's favour. "We would do it," he said. "We would turn the tide." Like most frontline soldiers, he had no idea what lay waiting on the other side of the minefields. At dawn, on the 4th of July 1943, the largest land battle in human history began. More than 2 million men, 35,000 guns, over 6,000 tanks and assault guns, and nearly 5,000 aircraft were about to collide. In the south, Hoth's attack opened at 3 in the afternoon. 12 hours later, Model's northern assault followed, but the Soviets were ready. Learning the precise timing of Model's barrage through intelligence channels, Soviet commanders ordered their artillery to fire first. Thousands of guns cracked open the night sky and smashed into the German lines even before Model's own batteries could respond. The Germans answered with Stuka strikes, Nebelwerfer rockets, and a short, violent bombardment of their own. The steppe lit up like a furnace. Then the armour went in. In the north, Tiger battalions, Elephant tank destroyers, and Brummbär assault guns punched into the Soviet belts. They cracked the first line, then the second, but beyond each one was another. 8 defensive zones in depth, 8 killing grounds. Every gap opened by the Tigers filled instantly with close combat teams, sappers, mines, anti-tank rifles, and dug-in guns. The Elephants, Hitler's prized heavy tank destroyers, proved both deadly and disastrously flawed. Their 88mm guns tore through Soviet armour at long range, but their lack of a defensive machine gun left them helpless against the flood of Soviet infantry. Veterans later recalled how some crews resorted to firing their MG-42s down the Ferdinand's main barrel, desperately trying to stop sappers from climbing the casemate and slapping explosives onto the engine deck. It was here, in these first grinding, muddy hours, that the real nature of Kursk emerged. Not the cinematic tank duel of legend, but a suffocating, close-range battle of mines, trenches, foxholes, sappers, engineers, infantrymen crawling through wheatfields, and tank crews fighting blind in dust and smoke. The tanks were only one part of it. The men on foot, German and Soviet, were the ones who paid the highest price. The German advance in the north stalled sooner than anyone expected. One of Model's nastiest surprises came from a single Soviet assault gun regiment. Just 12 of the new Su-152. The Red Army crews called them Zveroboi, the animal hunters, and the name was not an exaggeration. In a matter of hours, the heavy 152mm guns smashed 7 elephants and a dozen tigers, their shells hitting with such force that German crews later said it felt like the tanks were being struck by hammers the size of telegraph poles. A week into the fighting, Model's 9th Army was spent. Despite throwing in everything he had, infantry, armour, assault guns, pioneers, the northern attack had barely advanced 9 miles. The men were exhausted, sleepless, and covered in black dust that clung to their skin even after rain. We were going forward, as one infantryman recalled, but the land itself seemed to push back. Soviet losses were equally horrific, yet they did nothing to slow Zhukov's ambition. On the 11th of July, he launched a counter-offensive against Orel, smashing into Model's flank just as the Germans were trying to break into the open. Soviet artillery thundered day and night. Entire rifle battalions melted into the fields, but Zhukov, who had failed twice before to destroy Army Group Center in winter operations, was fixated on finishing the job here. In doing so, he underestimated what was happening in the south, where Manstein's powerful thrust was beginning to carve deeply into the salient. Down in the south, the battle opened with an artillery barrage so savage that it stayed with the survivors for the rest of their lives. Alfred Novotny, a fusilier of the elite Großdeutschland division, later said the first hours still haunted him 50 years on. The noise, flak, artillery, mortars, Stukas, Nebelwerfers. It was like the sky was being torn open, and the rain, endless rain. We were soaked before we even took a step, knee-deep in mud with 80 pounds of equipment on our backs. Across the front, countless German infantrymen experienced the same thing. Visibility near zero, soaked uniforms, mud-swallowing boots, men stumbling into shell holes in the dark, clawing their way out, while the sky flashed white and orange. The Soviets defending Novotny's sector were just as formidable as those in the north. The difference was that Manstein's Southern Shock Group relied on massed armour from the first minute. The opening bombardment, heavier than anything Germany had fired in France or Poland, cleared the way for Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, the largest armoured concentration Germany assembled in the entire war. At first, the results were impressive. 4th Panzer Army tore into the lines of the Soviet 1st Tank Army and 6th Guards Army. These were not raw troops, they were elite Guards formations, many hardened in the rubble of Stalingrad. Even so, the initial German momentum forced them back, yard by bloody yard. But the panzers paid for every foot of ground. On the left wing, the 200 Panthers committed at Kursk revealed their weaknesses almost immediately. Engines overheated, final drives seized, crews rushed through training, struggled to coordinate under fire. On paper, the Panther was one of the best tanks of the war. At Kursk, it was an overgrown prototype. By the end of the second day, only 50 were operational. Within 5 days, that number had fallen to 10. The fighting shifted to the old workhorses. The Panzer V, the Panzer IV with its new skirts, the assault guns, and a few heavy Tigers, their 80s knocking out tanks at frightening ranges. These machines carried the battle forward, often with infantry clinging to the hulls, soaked and shivering as Soviet shells chased them across the wheatfields. For the men of General Otto von Knobelsdorff's 48th Panzer Corps, the advance was a crawl through hell. Swamps swallowed tanks, streams turned into traps, every slope hid a trench, every trench hid mines. Engineers cleared paths under machine gun fire, crawling on hands and knees, while Soviet snipers waited for movement. Infantrymen dashed forward, only to be shredded by concealed anti-tank rifle teams or blown apart by satchel charges hurled from holes in the ground. Veterans recalled fighting not against one enemy, but against multiple layers of them stacked on top of each other. Sappers, anti-tank gunners, machine gunners, then T-34s, then tank destroyers behind them. It felt, one Panzer Grenadier said, as if the Russians had buried an entire army in the soil. The land itself favoured the defence. The ground rose gradually toward Kursk, giving the Soviets a perfect view of every German movement. Artillery observers simply watched the panzers approach and called down fire in sheets. Even so, Großdeutschland reached the outskirts of Kruglik and Nowoselovka by 9th July. Their infantry crawled through ditches filled with rainwater, stepping over bodies half buried in churned mud. On the left, the 3rd Panzer Division was fighting for its life in the woods north of Beresovka, where Katukov's 1st Tank Army held them firm. Vatutin reacted instantly, shifting 2 tank corps and a rifle division from reserve to crush the German momentum. Kursk was no longer a tank battle. It was a battle of human beings, tens of thousands of them, tearing each other apart in mud, smoke, and dust. And the worst was still to come. With its left flank suddenly exposed, the Großdeutschland division abandoned its push to the north and pivoted southwest on July 10th. The plan was simple but brutal. Trap the Soviet forces caught between Großdeutschland and the 3rd Panzer Division, crush them, and reopen the road toward Oboyan. One soldier from Großdeutschland described the moment the Luftwaffe arrived overhead. Squadron after squadron of Stukas came in over us, dropping their loads on the Russian armour. Each blast lit the fields with a white flash. You could see enemy tanks erupting like furnaces. Major Franz of the division's assault gun battalion advanced toward the village of Kruglik when the horizon erupted. At barely 300 meters, he saw fiery red streaks coming straight toward us from the village edge. A second later, explosions tore the earth in front of his guns. The Soviets had opened up with a full Stalin organ barrage, the rockets ripping entire gaps in the German line and showering the assault guns with soil, splinters, and burning fragments of timber. Across the field, Soviet commanders fought with the same desperation. General Andrei Getman later recalled those days simply. Many of our soldiers and officers fell in those 5 days of ferocious fighting. Even so, our corps held on. We only stopped the German attacks at nightfall because we had nothing left to throw forward. By that evening, The 3rd Panzer Division had joined the chaotic struggle in the groves and ravines north of Berezovka, where the fighting had nearly destroyed the Soviet 6th Tank Corps. On July 11th, what remained of the 6th Tank Corps and the shattered 90th Guards Rifle Division withdrew westward in disorder. The 3rd Panzer Division took over Großdeutschland's forward positions so the division could reorganize for another push, but the Germans never got the chance. During the night, reinforced Soviet counterattacks slammed into the new positions and hurled the 3rd Panzer Division back out of the ground it had taken only hours earlier. While Großdeutschland fought to stabilize its flank, General Knobelsdorff ordered the 11th Panzer Division to push north along the road to Oboyan and the River Sol. At dawn, the division's reconnaissance elements reached the high ridge overlooking the Sol Valley. One of the soldiers later wrote, "You could see far across the valley, all the way to the last natural barrier before Kursk. Through field glasses, the towers of Oboyan rose in the haze. It looked close enough to touch, barely 12 miles. But distance meant little. The Soviet defenders, though mauled heavily by the 11th Panzer Division's assault, refused to break. Vatutin gathered new reserves and prepared a massive counterstroke. His orders were clear: encircle and annihilate the German spearhead advancing toward Oboyan and Prohorovka. Victory was still possible for either side, but the window was closing fast. On the right wing of the 4th Panzer Army, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was simultaneously driving deep toward Prohorovka and was on the verge of a breakthrough. SS General Paul Hauser's armoured spearheads reached the River Sol on July 10th. On his left flank, the 3rd SS Panzer Grenadier Division Totenkopf crossed the river on pontoon bridges and immediately fell into close combat with the Soviet 52nd Guards Rifle Division and the 11th Motorized Rifle Brigade. To avoid further delays, Hauser sent his 2 other Panzer Grenadier Divisions south of the river where the ground was firmer. Their objective was unchanged: force a passage toward Prohorovka before Soviet reserves could seal the gap. The 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Division Das Reich pushed east through a storm of artillery, minefields, and dug in Soviet armour belonging to the 2nd Tank Corps and elements of the 5th Guards Army. By July 9th, the forward companies of the Leibstandarte had already reached the outskirts of Prohorovka itself, their vehicles grinding past burned-out Soviet positions, the air still thick with smoke from the previous night's bombardment. For a brief moment, the Germans benefited from clear skies and air superiority. Stukas roared overhead, slicing through Soviet positions, while Vatutin's hurried and often chaotic redeployments caused Soviet infantry in some sectors to fall back in confusion. But the temporary advantage vanished quickly. By July 11th, Soviet paratroopers of the 9th Guards Airborne Division had dug themselves into the small villages and ravines west of Prohorovka. One paratrooper later recalled the moment the SS divisions closed in. The village of Lutovo shook like a drum. Bombs, shells, mines, everything fell at once. We watched from our foxholes as German half-tracks opened and infantry poured out behind them. Their faces were twisted, exhausted, smeared with mud. They fired as they ran, sticking close behind their tanks. We opened fire from the flanks and the whole line lit up. Further south, General Hermann Breith's 3rd Panzer Corps struggled to break through along the line east of the Donets River. The 7th Guards Army and the 69th Army pressed relentlessly against Breith's flanks, slowing the German advance at every tree line and village. Von Manstein urged Kempf to push harder and get Breith's men up alongside Hauser's SS Corps before the opportunity slipped away. On July 11th, the Tigers of the 503rd Heavy Panzer Detachment crashed through the Soviet 305th Rifle Division and into the 107th behind it. The 6th Panzer Division surged nearly 8 miles in a single lunge, with the 19th Panzer Division pushing forward on its right. The Soviet lines there were thin and shaken. If Vatutin did not reinforce immediately, Breith and Hauser would break through toward Prohorovka and collapse the southern shoulder of the salient. By now, 7 Soviet armies surrounded the deep wedge carved by the 4th Panzer Army and the Kempf Army. To blunt the German advance and launch Stalin's planned counterstroke, Vatutin committed Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards tank army far earlier than intended. Rotmistrov's arrival transformed the battlefield. Reinforced by 2 tank corps and several self-propelled gun brigades from Konev's steppe front, the 5th Guards tank army fielded around 850 tanks, including 500 T-34s. Stalin ordered Zhukov to fly to Prohorovka at once and take command of the unfolding battle. The order given to Rotmistrov was blunt and uncompromising. At dawn on the 12th of July, strike together with the 1st Tank Army and the 5th Guards Army. Destroy the enemy southwest of Prohorovka. When the sun broke over the horizon that morning, a humid haze hung across the steppe. North of the Sol River, the Totenkopf division assembled 121 tanks and assault guns to smash the Soviet line along the ridge line above the river. The fighting that followed was brutal and directionless, companies colliding head-on, riflemen fighting from irrigation ditches, entire platoons disappearing into wheatfields, churned by artillery. 3 Guards rifle divisions held the ground, and by midday, both sides had lost so many men that neither could claim progress. South of Prohorovka, General Hoth stood with a trench telescope, observing Das Reich's sector. What he saw was a cauldron of smoke, fire, and dust. The delay of the 3rd Panzer Corps had exposed Das Reich's right flank, forcing the division into a defensive posture just as Rotmistrov's massive tank force began to gather. The pressure was immediate. In one sector, 50 Soviet armoured vehicles drove along a ravine, unaware that a line of T-34s on the ridge above them belonged to Das Reich, captured Soviet tanks marked with hastily painted white crosses. The German crews opened fire without warning. The first Soviet vehicle, the only one with a radio, was destroyed instantly. The rest burned in a long chain of explosions down the valley. Elsewhere, a Soviet T-34 rammed straight into a German field kitchen before being knocked out by close-range fire. SS Second Lieutenant Hans Mennel, commanding a Mark IV, destroyed his 24th Soviet tank that day alone. Between Totenkopf and Das Reich, the Leibstandarte began its own attack at 10 minutes before 7 that morning. Soviet artillery and Katyusha rocket barrages screamed overhead, hammering the assembly areas. Panzer Grenadiers advanced east, north and south of the railway line, leading into Prohorovka. Crewmen in black uniforms and mottled camouflage jackets took one last draw from their cigarettes before climbing into their sand-yellow Mark IVs. Engines roared to life, the steel tracks rattling across the hard earth. Above them, reconnaissance aircraft fired red flares into the sky, a signal that enemy armour was already approaching over the ridgelines. The Germans pushed forward into a wall of smoke and noise, completely unaware that within the hour the steppe around Prohorovka would become the killing ground for one of the largest, closest-range armoured clashes of the entire war. The sound of engines rose first, deep, rolling thunder across the steppe. From the direction of Prohorovka came the armoured mass of the Red Army's 18th and 29th Tank Corps. Hundreds of tanks, advancing in groups of 40 or 50, burst out of the low ground and the outskirts of the town. Guards airborne riflemen clung to the hulls and engine decks, gripping handrails as the machines lurched forward at full speed. The charge hit the German line with almost no warning. Soviet tanks tore straight into the positions of the SS Panzer Grenadiers and the forward companies of Major Martin Gross's 2nd Panzer Battalion. An SS junior officer later described the chaos. "They were around us, on top of us, between us. We fought at arm's length, out of foxholes, throwing magnetic charges at the tanks. It was hell. Our company alone knocked out 15. It was the kind of fighting that left no room for tactics or maneuver, just instinct, smoke, and survival." Rudolf von Ribbentrop, commanding a small company of 6 Mark IV tanks, drove down a slope to reinforce the collapsing infantry screen. His gunners began firing at 800 meters, the German rounds blowing apart the first line of T-34s. The Mark IV was not faster than the Soviet tank nor better armoured, but its gun and optics were exact and familiar to crews who had spent years fighting across the steppe. That experience counted for everything in the first few minutes. Soviet infantry were thrown off burning tanks, some already dead, others scrambling for cover. The Soviet armoured waves pushed on straight into German lines until the battlefield dissolved into a melee of tank hulls grinding past one another. Rotmistrov, watching from a ridge, later said, "There was no space for formation, no time to reform. Tanks fired at 50 and 60 meters. Shells pierced even frontal armour." Ribbentrop later recalled, "A T-34 caught fire at barely 50 meters. The tank beside me took a direct hit and erupted. Another to the right followed. They kept coming. At this range, every shot found its mark." He destroyed 4 more Soviet tanks as the Soviet masses swept past him. Then he drove into the smoke, unnoticed among the burning wrecks, and emerged behind the advancing Soviet armour. Assault guns and 2 panzer companies lay hidden down the slope beyond an anti-tank ditch. Caught in the open, Soviet tanks were hit from multiple angles. Ribbentrop remembered the scene at the ditch. Burning tanks crashed into each other. It was an inferno, smoke, flames, shells exploding everywhere. A shell slammed into his turret, smashing the gunner's sight into his eye and wounding him. Even so, Ribbentrop and his crew managed to pull back to German lines after destroying 14 Soviet tanks. North of Oktyabrski, the shock of the day continued. Tigers of Captain Heinrich Kling's heavy company forced their way through hedgerows when a formation of nearly 60 T-34s burst out of a nearby wood less than a mile away. Michael Wittmann's Tiger shook from the recoil as his first round struck a Soviet tank head-on, but the Soviet formation did not slow. They fired while moving, closing the distance with alarming speed. 4 German Tigers were hit in the opening minutes, temporary kills, but enough to throw the line into momentary confusion. What followed was not the clean, spaced-out tank duel imagined in later accounts. It was close, choking, and personal. Crews inside the Tigers felt the concussions of nearby hits, the turret interiors filling with dust. Outside, shells tore through the grass, setting fields ablaze. Soviet tanks drove through smoke so thick that even the Tigers' optics struggled to find targets. The battle at Prohorovka had begun in earnest, not as an armoured chess match, but as a brutal collision of steel and human will at distances so close that crews could smell the burning paint of enemy tanks. Wittmann's Tiger lurched violently as 2 shells slammed into the hull, the shock ringing through the steel plates, but the tank remained operational. Only his radio operator had taken a wound in the upper arm. Through the smoke he heard his gunner shout, 3 o'clock! 300 meters! A T-34 burst out from a thicket, gun already swinging toward them. Balthasar Woll, Wittmann's gunner, reacted first. The Tiger's 88 fired, the recoil hammering the turret as the Soviet tank's turret was blown clean off the hull. Above them, the air suddenly filled with the screech of engines. Captain Hans-Ulrich Rudel's Stukas dove steeply, cutting through columns of oily black smoke rising from burning wrecks. One after another, the Stukas plunged toward the Soviet armour, their 37mm cannon raking the weaker rear plates of the T-34s. Moments later, swarms of Yak fighters swept in, tearing into the slow German dive bombers. Then Messerschmitts arrived, diving into the dogfight until the sky was as chaotic and violent as the ground below. Layers of smoke, fire, and falling wreckage. Through this storm, Wittmann's small platoon of 3 Tigers pushed forward. Flaming grass and churned earth whipped past the hull. They had bypassed the outskirts of Prohorovka when a voice snapped across the radio, Kling's unmistakable tone. "Achtung! Large tank force ahead! Many tanks!" On the far ridge, the lead elements of the Soviet 181st Tank Brigade emerged, disappeared into a shallow valley, then climbed back into view. A line of T-34s, stretching across the horizon, advanced at full speed. The Tigers, stationary and braced, opened fire at long range. Soviet tanks exploded in bright orange fireballs, but others pushed forward relentlessly. They needed to close to 800 meters to have any chance of punching through the thick frontal armor of the Tigers, and they meant to do it. Leading the Soviet charge was Captain Pavel Skripkin with a group of 15 tanks. He stood in his open hatch shouting, "Forward, follow me!" as his crews pushed their engines to the limit. Skripkin managed to fire and disable one of the Tigers by hitting its thinner side armor. Wittmann's gunner immediately returned fire. One round slammed into Skripkin's tank, then another. Flames engulfed the turret. Skripkin was dragged out by his crew, badly wounded, before the driver leapt back into the burning machine and drove it downhill, straight towards Staff Sergeant Georg Lutz's Tiger. The two tanks thundered toward each other. Lutz fired, but the round glanced off the Soviet turret, ricocheting upward. The burning T-34 rammed into the Tiger with a brutal crash that shook the ground. Both tanks were engulfed in fire. Lutz managed to reverse out moments before the Soviet tank's ammunition detonated in a violent burst. Despite the losses, scores of tanks burning across the fields, the Soviets would not break off. From north of Oktyabrski to south of Storozhevoy, the battle surged back and forth like a tide of steel. The Leibstandarte's infantry fought to hold every ridge and gully, but packs of Soviet armour repeatedly broke through. By late afternoon, the 1st Panzer Regiment had been pushed back toward Oktyabrski. Soviet tank brigades threatened to sever the connection between the Leibstandarte and Totenkopf at Vasilevka. In the south, at Storozhevoy, the grenadiers of the Leibstandarte faced an avalanche of tanks and mounted infantry. A German tank destroyer crewman later described it bluntly. Salvo after salvo of Stalin organs crashed onto us. Between the rocket barrages came mortar and artillery fire. Then the tanks came, T-34s rolling over the hill in lines. 3, 5, 10. We stopped counting. For a moment, Soviet tanks even penetrated to the village of Komsomolets, firing into the Leibstandarte's artillery positions at point-blank range. By mid-afternoon, storms swept across the battlefield. Heavy rain hissed against hot metal, turning the fields into steaming mud. Burning tanks crackled beneath the downpour. The ground turned to deep sludge, swallowing boots and bogging down vehicles. Exhausted crews on both sides found themselves at a standstill, too drained to continue pushing. Across Vatuten's entire front, every German advance on July 12th faltered. Yet the Soviet offensive also stalled under the weight of its own losses. Rotmistrov's 5th Guards tank army had been mauled. Of the 650 tanks committed, roughly 400 were wrecked or disabled, though only about 250 were complete write-offs. Gross's battalion alone claimed 90 destroyed tanks that day. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps lost just over 60 tanks and assault guns irreparably, far fewer than the Soviets, but enough to sap their offensive strength. The Corps owed much of its cohesion that day to its commander, Paul Hauser. Wounded years earlier and blind in one eye, Hauser led from the front, riding between positions, calming shattered platoons and reorganizing battered lines. His presence, as General Hoth later wrote, carried the men through the darkest hours of the day. For that leadership, Hauser was later awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross. During the night, both sides dug in with whatever strength they had left. Exhausted men clawed trenches out of the damp earth, stacking ammunition boxes as firing steps, dragging the wounded to improvised shelters, and bracing themselves for what everyone sensed would be a decisive day. Soldiers on both sides wrote later that they felt victory was still possible if they could summon one more day of endurance. At dawn on the 13th, the main weight of the fighting in the 2nd SS Panzer Corps shifted away from the Leibstandarte and fell heavily on Totenkopf and das Reich. With only 54 operational tanks and 20 assault guns left, Totenkopf pushed on north of the Psol River. There they collided with 2 Soviet Guards rifle divisions and the 51st Guards tank regiment. By midday, they had reached their assigned objective, the Prohorovka-Kartashevka road, but heavy attacks on their exposed left flank, combined with the Leibstandarte's inability to keep up south of the river, forced Totenkopf to pull back. Northeast of Oktyabrski, the Leibstandarte met fierce counterattacks by airborne infantry, rifle regiments, Soviet tanks, and artillery fire coordinated with dense minefields. Rotmistrov later wrote, "Our Katyushas always brought terror to the fascists. They were forced to fall back, leaving their burning tanks and their dead scattered across the fields. Yet when Soviet troops moved forward north of Komsomolet State Farm, they walked straight into a curtain of fire from German Nebelwerfer rocket batteries, the same weapon the Soviets had loosed so often on German lines. South of the Leibstandarte, das Reich captured Storozhevoy and pressed on to the edge of Vingoradovka. For the first time in days, Soviet commanders began to worry. If das Reich linked up with the advancing 3rd Panzer Corps, the entire Soviet position around Prohorovka could unravel. Part of that threat came from Major Franz Baker of the 6th Panzer Division, who executed one of the boldest night maneuvers of the entire offensive. Using a captured T-34 with its markings painted over, Baker led a column of panzers straight through Soviet lines in the darkness. The sentries saw only the silhouette of a familiar tank and waved the column through. After several miles, the captured T-34 broke down. No doubt moved by national sentiments, Baker joked later, but the German column pressed on, passing sleeping Soviet crews and parked tanks at arm's reach. In the dark, a full column of Soviet tanks appeared, heading the opposite direction. 22 of them rolled past Baker's panzers at nearly track-to-track distance, believing the Germans were their own, but 6 or 7 Soviet tanks suddenly slowed, turned, and fell in behind Baker's column. Sensing they had been discovered, Baker wheeled his command tank into their path. His tank had only a dummy gun, but he ordered his battalion to keep moving toward their objective, the Donets River Bridge at Rzavets. The Soviet tanks drew up in a semicircle behind him. Baker and his operations officer slipped out of their steel hull and crept up with hollow charges. A Soviet infantryman riding on one of the T-34s spotted movement and raised his rifle. Baker tore it from his hands and dived into a ditch. 3 explosions ripped through the night as the charges detonated. A 4th T-34 was knocked out by a supporting panzer. Both sides opened fire, lighting the river valley with muzzle flashes. The Soviets withdrew toward the bridge, blew it up, but failed to stop German grenadiers from wading across and capturing the position. By dawn, the bridge had been repaired, and the 3rd Panzer Corps was free to drive north. To halt them, General Kuzma Trifonov, deputy commander of the 5th Guards Tank Army, threw everything he had: rifle divisions, reinforced Guards tank brigades, and mechanized formations against the German advance. On July 13th, as the 19th Panzer Division and the 7th Panzer Division tried to break out from the bridgehead, the 6th Panzer Division held off Trifonov's attacks around Alexandrovka. Then disaster struck. A German Heinkel bomber, misidentifying its target, dropped its payload directly onto 6th Panzer Division headquarters. 15 men were killed outright. Baker, Major General Walter von Hunersdorf, and 47 other officers were wounded. To the west, the Großdeutschland Division's planned northward push was abandoned. A fresh Soviet assault crashed into the 3rd Panzer Division, temporarily severing radio contact and forcing the Germans back from Beresovka. On Großdeutschland's right, the 11th Panzer Division was also halted by wave after wave of Soviet counterattacks. Rain poured down again, turning every road into churned mud and slowing the resupply columns to a crawl. Despite these setbacks, both Hoth and Kempf still believed a breakthrough was within reach. But at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler decided otherwise. Summoning his senior commanders, he revealed that Allied forces had landed in Sicily on July 10th. The offensive, Operation Citadel, had to be halted immediately. Troops were needed in Italy. Field Marshal Klug agreed, already under immense pressure from Zhukov's oral counteroffensive. Citadel was over. Von Manstein, who had argued from the beginning that the Kursk operation was already stale by July, refused to accept that the battle should end just as German forces were finally grinding down the Soviet defences. He told Hitler bluntly, to break off the battle now would mean throwing away victory. He still had the fresh 24th Panzer Corps in reserve, with more than 100 operational tanks and believed he could wear the Soviets down through sheer attrition, then use the regained initiative to stall Soviet offensives forming elsewhere. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin summed up Manstein's position in one stark image: "We had seized the wolf by the ears and dared not let him go." But Hitler had already made his decision. Sicily had changed everything. 4 days later, orders came down to pull the 2nd SS Panzer Corps out of the line, followed by Großdeutschland's transfer north to Army Group Center. Until those formations actually departed, Manstein pushed them hard, determined to destroy as many Soviet formations as possible before the curtain finally came down. On July 14th and 15th, Großdeutschland and the 3rd Panzer Division fought 2 tank corps, a guards formation and several Soviet rifle divisions in a series of punishing engagements. They clawed back the ground they had lost 2 days earlier. Entire Soviet battalions were driven westward in disorder, only to run straight into German artillery concentrations that shattered them across the fields. Yet the most dangerous threat for the Soviets was not the immediate losses, it was the narrowing gap between the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and the 3rd Panzer Corps. If the jaws closed, 5 Soviet divisions inside the pocket would be trapped. Even badly wounded, both Baker and Hühnersdorf returned to the front to lead the 6th Panzer Division in another assault on Alexandrovka. Baker himself knocked out 2 Soviet tanks and an anti-tank gun during the attack. His battle group destroyed 29 more tanks and 25 heavy guns, but Hühnersdorf's luck ran out. On July 14th, a sniper's bullet struck him in the head. He died instantly, one of countless experienced officers whose loss would be felt long after Kursk. That same day, house-to-house fighting tore through the village of Belenicino in the Das Reich sector. Grenadiers fought through alleys filled with debris, smoke, and dead livestock, Soviet tanks firing point-blank down narrow lanes. 12 Soviet tanks were destroyed in the melee. In the middle of that chaos, SS Lance Corporal Simon Grasher lay pinned down under small arms fire, grenades, and tank cannon blasts. 2 T-34s on the flank were tearing his company apart. Crawling forward alone, Grasher fought through 2 bunkers and several machine gun nests to reach the tanks. With his final hollow charge, he destroyed the first T-34. When the second tank halted and its hatch opened momentarily, Grasher hurled a grenade inside. The explosion killed the crew. Grasher was cut down minutes later as the fighting continued around him. He received the Knight's Cross posthumously, one of many individual acts of reckless bravery that bought the Germans a few more hours of survival. Actions like Grasher's allowed the reinforced Trifonov only to slow, not stop, the growing contact between Das Reich and the 7th Panzer Division on July 15th. But the delay was long enough for most of the Soviet divisions caught between the 2 German spearheads to slip away before the trap snapped shut. By July 16th, Hoth and Kempf finally stood in a position to resume the push toward Kursk. Their formations still existed on paper, and many tanks remained operational, but the men themselves were worn to the bone. 10 straight days of fighting had drained every company, every battalion. Mud, exhaustion, lost officers, and a constant rain of artillery fire had taken their toll. Meanwhile, 60 miles of Soviet-held territory still lay between them and Model's northern pincer. Von Mellenthin observed the situation coldly. Großdeutschland was dangerously weak after 10 days of heavy fighting. The Russian striking power had not appreciably diminished. In fact, it seemed to have increased. And it had. The remaining 27th and 53rd armies of Konev's steppe front were moving into position, along with the fresh 4th Guards Tank Corps and 1st Mechanized Corps, nearly 400 tanks by themselves, closing in on Oboyan and the approaches northwest of Prohorovka. Had Manstein been allowed to unleash his reserves, the clash might have produced a second, even larger Prohorovka. But the chance would never come. On July 17th, Manstein issued the order to withdraw. The offensive was over. Zhukov later wrote that his own forces, 1st Tank Army, 6th Guards Army, 7th Guards Army were so exhausted that they could not stop the orderly German withdrawal toward the Belgorod defensive line. By July 23rd, most German formations had pulled back in good order, only to be immediately thrown into new battles as the Soviets shifted into full offensive operations elsewhere. Kursk had ended, not with a dramatic breakthrough, but with a slow, grinding, irreversible ebb of German strength. For all the talk of tigers, elephants, panthers, and the so-called greatest tank battle in history, the real cost of Kursk was paid in human beings. What happened around Oboyan and Prohorovka was not a duel of armoured giants, but a vast slaughterhouse where entire brigades and regiments ceased to exist in a matter of hours. German armour fought with ruthless skill. From Army Group Centre to Army Group South, the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS destroyed more than 1,000 Soviet armoured vehicles. Some units, like das Reich, destroyed nearly 10 Soviet tanks for every one they lost. Wittmann alone added 30 tank kills to his tally in those 2 weeks. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps accounted for more than 1,100 Soviet machines knocked out. But tanks were only half the story, and the numbers hid the truth. It was the infantry who bled the most. Across the salient, the Germans lost around 50,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Behind that figure lies the reality of burnt-out platoons, shattered pioneer companies, and panzergrenadier battalions reduced to a few dozen exhausted survivors. On paper, the German casualties seem lower than the Soviet losses, but for Germany, these losses were terminal. They came from the core of the army: Großdeutschland, das Reich, Leibstandarte, Totenkopf, the Panzer Grenadiers, the assault gun crews, and the old infantry regiments that had survived since 1941. Soviet losses were staggering. At least 177,000 casualties, many divisions losing half their men in a single week. Whole Soviet formations were wiped from the map at Prohorovka. More than 1,600 Soviet tanks and assault guns were irreparably destroyed, and those numbers exclude the machines dragged off the battlefield burnt out, immobilized, or too damaged to fight again. The reality of Kursk was this: tens of thousands of dead men lying in wheatfields, on the edges of mine belts, in the ruins of villages, inside burned-out tanks and collapsed trenches. Battalions fought to extinction. Rifle companies went into an attack with 100 men and came back with 8. Panzer crews climbed out of their vehicles to find the supporting infantry gone, cut down by artillery or buried by Soviet Katyusha strikes. The battle drained both armies, but only one side could replace what it lost. Von Mellenthin later said, "With the failure of our supreme effort, the initiative passed to the Russians. Kursk was a complete and most regrettable failure." Von Manstein agreed. Once Hitler called off Citadel, the Eastern Front's fate was sealed. Guderian said it bluntly: "By the failure of Citadel, we suffered a decisive defeat." Soviet propaganda inflated the numbers wildly, claiming 500,000 German casualties and thousands of German tanks destroyed, but the truth was damaging enough without exaggeration. When modern historians and newly opened archives compare German and Soviet records, a far sharper picture emerges. Kursk was tactically a German success. Operationally, it was impressive, but strategically, it was fatal. The Germans won many of the local battles. They destroyed far more tanks. Their elite formations fought with extraordinary skill and inflicted massive losses, but they could not replace the 50,000 casualties suffered in just 2 weeks. Those were the men who held the front together. Those were the veterans trained in 1940 and 1941. Once they were gone forever. The Soviet Union, by contrast, replaced its losses within months. Kursk was the moment the war changed shape. After Citadel, Germany would never again launch a major strategic offensive in the east. Every battle after this, Kharkov, Kiev, Korsun, Kovel, Jassy, was defensive. A retreat that would end in the ruins of East Prussia, the gates of Königsberg, the streets of Budapest, and finally the cellars beneath Berlin. The tanks may have shaped the narrative, but it was the destruction of Germany's last reserve of elite infantry, Leibstandarte, das Reich, Totenkopf, Großdeutschland, and the panzer divisions of Hoth and Kempf that changed the direction of the war. Kursk wasn't just a tank battle, it was a graveyard of divisions. And it marked the moment Germany began its long, irreversible march back toward its own borders. And that brings this video to a close. I hope you found it interesting and learned something new. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and I appreciate every one of you who supports the work I do here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, and goodbye for now.